Dennis O'Rourke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. New Zealand First has consistently always opposed the sale of farmland to foreigners, and we're very glad to see that the Labor Party now also adopts that policy. I want to give a number of reasons for this. Firstly, it causes an inexorable rise in farm prices in New Zealand. Foreigners, of course, are not...
A point of order, Dr Russell Norman.
Mr Speaker, we have constant interjections down this end from David Bennett over here. The interjections include such things as accusing my colleague of being a liar and various other. Interjections should not be constant yelling, pointless yelling across the chamber.
Well, I don't need any assistance. This has been quite a spirited debate, and I know that when Honourable Maurice Williamson was speaking, that created quite a bit of interjection and comment as well, and it has been a spirited debate. I wish that all members would show some courtesy in this House, and I just would caution members that it is an opportunity for debate and for listening to each other, and interjection should be rare and reasonable. Dennis O'Rourke.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I actually didn't hear any interjections anyway. But I'll repeat what I said at the beginning. First of all, New Zealand First has consistently always opposed the sale of farmland to foreigners, and we're glad to see that Labor has now followed that policy as well. I was beginning to say that there are a number of very good reasons for this. Firstly, farm prices cause an inexorable rise of prices for farm, especially farms and best farmland in New Zealand. And foreigners, of course, are not financially constrained in the way that many New Zealanders are. So that, of course, leads to a significant disadvantage to people in New Zealand who want to embark upon a farming career. And this is driven by a shortage of quality farmland overseas, and we do not want to impose and import that problem into this country. And, Mr Speaker, foreign buyers are, for those reasons, hungry for fertile, well-watered land in the temperate zone, such as particularly in this country. New Zealand First would impose strict restrictions on foreign ownership of farmland, and we would impose the same sort of restrictions on foreigners that Kiwis face if they want to buy farmland in other countries. And in relation to this, as I've already indicated, is the asset which this country has in abundance, fresh water. And water claims, of course, water claims and water resources are closely related to the value of farming and are closely related to why so many overseas buyers want to buy farms in New Zealand. New Zealand First strongly opposes the sale of all strategic assets, especially farmland and especially related water resources. We are opposed to any particular group gaining exclusive rights to what is essentially a public resource. Issues affecting the country's fresh water as well as farmland should be considered from a national perspective. Now, Mr Speaker, another reason for opposing the sale of farmland overseas is that it actually does mean that New Zealand farmers are deprived of the opportunity to buy farmland at reasonable prices. It effectively does do that because it drives farm prices up, and it inflates farm prices, and we must not see a bidding war for farms driven by overseas purchases in this country. Now, included is an opportunity to develop further the New Zealand farming culture, a farming culture of great success and a farming culture of innovation. There is every possibility that that will be damaged by overseas farmers who are not part of that culture and do not have the best interests of New Zealand farming at heart. Furthermore, and another reason, is a loss of New Zealand's economic sovereignty. The sales of farms, the sales of such a strategic asset do, if they go unchecked over time, mean that we become tenants in our own land and we lose sovereignty over our destiny in the long term. Economically, Mr. Speaker, it's very difficult to see what the benefit is of allowing the sale of farmland overseas. Overseas investors in New Zealand can still invest in other ways. They can finance New Zealanders into farms with loans and with other economic instruments. And, Mr. Speaker, another reason is that the reasons given by the government for allowing this for economic reasons are utterly and completely inadequate. And I note, for example, that the Prime Minister, when justifying the sale of farmlands overseas, said, and I quote on one occasion, quote, "Overall, we've believed that, yes, the bid by the Chinese company can add value and allow us to have a good distributor into China." And that, of course, is an utterly inadequate reason why we should allow the sale of New Zealand farmland overseas, because access to the Chinese market is simply not dependent upon Chinese farm ownership in this country. Mr. Speaker, the competence of overseas owner is another issue. And we don't know, if this goes on unchecked into the future, what sort of competence overseas owners of farms in this country will have. It's all very well for the Court of Appeal and others to say, as at today, this overseas purchaser looks like a competent farmer. But when they sell to other overseas people, or when they go ahead and farm these properties over time, how can we be sure that they will be as competent as we know New Zealand farmers are? So it's not necessarily a situation that will endure. And the last reason I want to give is this, why we should be so opposed to the sale of New Zealand farmland overseas, and it's simply this. There is no guarantee that large overseas corporations will not, through successive purchases of farmlands, aggregate farmland, one farm after the other, and become so dominant that they are effectively control a significant part of New Zealand's economic resources. And, Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, I say this. I say the loss of these particular properties is a black day for New Zealand. These farms will be gone forever. And what of the assurances that have been received? And you can hear some of the caterwauling from the other side of the House, which, like those assurances, are empty words, absolutely no real value in them whatsoever. And I might say the vast majority of New Zealanders don't see any value in those assurances, and that they know in their hearts, and they know from what they've heard, that the sale of these assets of New Zealand farmland overseas cannot ever be in the interests of this country. And I say further that after all the controversy, this government still refuses to act to protect the national interest with a small n, of course. It may be a national interest with a large N, I'm not sure of that, but certainly not a national interest with a small n. And, Mr. Speaker, New Zealanders do have a special connection to their land, and that land is being alienated. Who will defend that land in the future? Certainly not this government. This government is leading this country down the road ultimately to impoverishment by selling farms overseas to farmers whose performance in the long term we cannot be sure of, and whose agenda we ought to have the greatest possible suspicion of. The New Zealand Overseas Investment Office is itself a joke. In fact, it's a worse joke. It's a fraud. It simply rubber stamps the transfer of assets into foreign hands. And, Mr. Speaker, I've had personal experience of this in my work in the past as a lawyer, and have acted for the purchases of farmland and have acted for them in terms of applications to the Overseas Investment Commission. And I can tell you that their process is utterly inadequate, and it is in fact virtually a rubber stamp. You cannot put the hands of important assets of this kind into the hands of an organisation like that. The New Zealand First position is clear. Stop the sale of strategic assets, especially farms, and stop compromising New Zealand's economic sovereignty in this way.
Honourable David Cunliffe.
Mr Speaker, it's good to be back. Mr Speaker, I've just got back and...